How do we learn lessons from the past? How do we leave behind our global problems and bring about a new era for humanity? What are the technologies and behaviors we need to adopt to make sustainable change? And how do we bring all that back to the people who can take action to change the world? These are the questions that Futurist Adah Parris has been grappling with in the face of the challenges we have today. On today's show, Adah will help shine a light on these questions and give us ways to recognize new patterns that can lead to a better future. But before we get started, click on the like button below, do subscribe, and click on the alert button so you can get notified anytime we post new content. Okay, on with the show.
Burning desire, big ideas, bold action.
I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Adah Parris today. She is a futurist, a cultural strategist, a system designer, and most of all, an artist. Adah is known as a polymath and enthusiastic curator of people, patterns, and stories. In 2020, she was longlisted as one of the most influential women in UK technology. Adah has been a long-time innovator in pushing the boundaries of storytelling in the virtual medium and has a long view on how emerging technologies will shape us and our future, and how we might best shape those technologies to produce thriving on this planet. Adah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm curious, and I don't always ask this question, but anybody that calls themselves a futurist, I'm really curious, what does that mean to you? What is a futurist for you?
Well, firstly, I never initially called myself a futurist. It was something that was given to me, a title given to me. And for me, I don't pretend to have a crystal ball and try and predict trends. It's more about recognizing, and I was defining it a little while ago, but it's being able to acknowledge the past and know that we have to learn from the past, be very present in the present, and then looking at how we can use the lessons from the past to help us shape the future. So co-design the future, and looking at that from a perspective of how it impacts us as societies, as cultures, our identity, our economics, all of those things, rather than trying to just go, this is what I see the future of technology is. Where are we moving to? And how is our relationship with technology shifting? Or what are some of the patterns that we've recognized from the past that are just repeating? The only difference is the type of technology. We've gone from analog to digital, to where we don't know yet.
Yeah, I love that notion of the past and there's a couple of pieces of the past we should be really aware of. One is pitfalls, right? We've screwed this one up this way in the past before, or we've messed this one up repeatedly over and over as long as human beings have been on the planet. How do we watch out for that and make sure we don't put that into our future? And also just the notion that there are these long arcs and patterns, and that becoming aware of them gives us a much better access to know and notice where things are going through in the future. And I think a lot of us get really hung up on the day's news. Like the immediacy, especially in the digital era, the immediacy of so much news and so much content that it seems like this moment is always the most important moment that a human being has ever faced.
Yeah, and we forget that we've been here before. And I think that part of that is really understanding the language that we're using and recognizing that, technology is not just something digital or algorithmic. It comes from the words of craft and art and process. And so we've always had forms of technology. We may not recognize them as that. It's just that they weren't digital. And for me, the way that we use tech is to do three things: to connect with ourselves, to connect with our environment, and to connect with others. So, cave people would have used flint or, spears or what have you. And, now we're using other forms of technology to do exactly the same thing. In the future, we will be using technology to do a very similar thing. So those are the patterns that connects everything. And if we can recognize those patterns in the past and in the present, then we can have an idea of how we would use technology in the future.
Yeah, and I just wanted to just talk about a little bit how we talk about futurism and how I talk about myself as a futurist. I was a traditional futurist in the late 90s, early 2000s, hire us to figure out what the future of TV is going to look like, et cetera, et cetera. We did these big projects. We tried to figure out what the future of a certain technology would be like. And, that kind of looking for trends and things like that. I don't really consider futurism more as just being a predictor of patterns. And and what we talk about when we talk about the future now that we think is really, really significant is not only having that ability to have the long view going back, but having a really long view, and instead of predicting the future, generating the future. Saying, declaring things, imagining, creating stories that help us pull us into a better future. Really interested in talking to you about stories and technology, of course, and how we see those things evolving or co-evolving. And just want to stop for a second and say, thank you for all the kind of pioneering work that you did, especially around dance and the virtual stuff, and the pushing of the boundaries of what it means to be present and physically embodied and all those things. I rarely get to talk with somebody who's been playing these games as long as I have, and really made the kind of choice to be an innovator versus a consumer of other creative ideas and technology. We see a lot of that. Somebody has an idea, somebody else turns it into money. But there are those that are the kind of forerunners, and I really appreciate about your work specifically. Tell me what a little bit. What is your passion in this area? Technology and future art. What is it that's still having you have the drive that you have to keep innovating and keep being a leader?
I think more and more recently, I've realized that I'm a systems thinker. I didn't realize that before. I thought that everybody recognized these patterns across different places. And I get really excited by recognizing a pattern in the world that probably most people wouldn't put together. And so looking at those things and thinking, well, what are some of the lessons that we can learn? But also my work now, and I say work, but it's my passion. It's who I am. It's what I do, whether I'm creating art or what have you. But it's always around this area of, I created this, or I recognized a pattern that I called Cyborg Shamanism. And that is now a lens through which we can look at the world. And so what excites me is recognizing that pattern in everything. So it's a framework that I've created that has 5 phases. The first is leave. How do we leave the old ways behind? We acknowledge that there are problems. And rather than spending time trying to work on those problems, we say, how do we leave those problems behind to create new value systems? The second is grow. The second is breathe. How are we going to remove those tensions in the system to create a hypothesis for change? The third is grow. What are the tools, technologies, rituals, behaviors that we need to try and make that true, or to try and see, stress test it? The fourth is flow. And we tend to ask the question, what type of ancestor do you want to be? So how are we making it sustainable? And that's what you're talking about, that long-term thinking. So not just thinking about our generation or our children's generation or their generation, but actually longer than that. And then the fifth one is ground. I'm losing count today. The fifth one is ground. How do we ground that down to create a sense of, I used to say citizenship, and actually we now talk about kinship, because it's that relationship with everything that is other. And so that framework, those 5 things, I'm recognizing that in all sorts of worlds, and that excites me. So spirituality, quantum mechanics, algorithmic technology, faith-based religions, metaphysics, it's all in all of those things. And so when I see it, I get really excited because I go, there's lessons that can be learned from that world and brought into these other worlds.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I love it. And I want to actually make sure I get that framework to share with our listeners in the notes. And what occurs to me just when you said that is that, Adah has a methodology or a framework for us to actually add competency to our capacity to think in long terms. I mean, like human beings are in our animal nature, we're really concerned about preservation in the current moment. Am I going to eat, or am I going to be eaten? Am I safe in the pack? Do I have good stature, social stature in the group? And then beyond that, then I can start to think of other things. But that's a moment by moment by moment stress on us. And you're talking about a way to give us access to thinking about bigger timeframes, both in the past and towards the future. And then I love the part about just distinguish the past and leave it behind, because we can't get just stuck in, oh man, that's bad. Because that's another obsession of the human brain, is like to focus on the absolute negative, the worst of everything. And I think that's what's given rise to grievance culture so much, is we just have such a innate habit of finding out what's wrong.
And I think part of the problem is that we as a society tend to get stuck in binaries. It's either or. And so those binaries create a level of competition that means that we're all, people end up spinning themselves out because it's, well, I've got to be this or that. Whereas I take a systemic approach, a living systems approach now to everything that we do, that recognizing that living systems are self-operating organisms that have an impact on their environment. So that's us as humans, that's everything that we do. And so recognizing that what we should be doing is having a holistic living system, systemic approach to everything, and recognizing the interconnections and interconnections of everything means that we have to have a different approach to doing things, which also means we are able to bring in those other voices, those other lived experiences, those other knowledge and wisdom, because everybody's on an even playing field. There isn't a hierarchy of, well, technology from Silicon Valley is better than indigenous technologies from New Zealand. They're all trying to do the same thing. And what I do, and what my co-founder Marcus Anderson and I do, is bring those different worlds together.
It occurs to me that inside of technology, we have we're incentivized to turn on money-making machines, right? That's the incentive inside of tech, versus maybe your indigenous culture in New Zealand might be incentivized by something else that might look a little bit more like wisdom, or you mentioned living systems, and symbiosis is a really the waste of one living organism in the ecosystems, the food of another. We don't live like that as human beings. We just take, and then our waste is toxic. Tell me a bit about how can we start to look for technologies that are both innovative, and maybe they make money. I'm not saying capitalism has to go, but have more of a positive impact upon humans, impact on each other and the world. Where does that come from? Where do we look to find that?
So a couple of things. I mentioned it earlier, language.
Yeah.
That if first of all, if I asked you what you meant by innovation, I make a very different description of that. And those descriptions of those words and our relationship with those words are based on our experiences. And so they're very much person-centered. They're very much based on our location, our experience, our knowledge, our wisdom. But actually, the words translate across many boundaries. And so I think that what we need to do is really start to really look at what we mean by particular things. So what do we mean by technology, and recognize that it's also not binary. It's all of these things are fluid. But the other thing that we need to do, and this probably comes first, is that we need to create new hierarchies of needs. So, we look at people tend to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but through the research that we've done, we've realized, and there's photos of him, that Maslow actually took those hierarchy of needs from the Blackfoot Nations peoples and flipped them on their head and put self-actualization, this I at the top. Whereas when you start to look at indigenous cultures, what they have as a base is that there needs to be, it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that the planet is safe. Because without that, we would not have, access to food or anything else like that. And so it becomes the base level is a we rather than I. And so I think once we start to create new hierarchies of needs, we then have a different approach and a different relationship with ourselves, with the planet, with money, with everything, because then we realize that, to your point, everything is connected. I remember one of my colleagues one of my peers on one of the programs I was on recently said that nature creates no waste. And so if nature creates no waste, why can't our economic money systems replicate that? That, it's not just being filtered off to the 1% of the 1%, but actually what we're doing, Marcus and I, is we're looking at where are some of these systems that are constantly flowing. So I'm quite fascinated by looking at water conservation, how nature makes sure that water continually flows. And if we look at those models, why can't we use that as a business model?
And create, use our innovation, our ability to imagine something other than what we have. And I really think, actually, I think it was a good point about innovation, because what tech means in innovation is anything that digitizes something in the old world and makes money off of it. That's innovation. But if we look maybe towards what's needed, is that kind of innovation can be bankrupt of imagination. It can be actually not very creative at all. In effect, if you are creative, like I am and you are, it's sometimes the things that are winning in technology just seem so boring. I mean, like, oh my goodness, how can that win? It's such a reductionist, base level, making micro amounts of money out of something thing that doesn't seem innovative at all, really.
Exactly. And I think that we get into this loop of what's the next big thing, what's the next big thing, what's the next big thing. Are you going to be the next Facebook? Are you going to be the next, Instagram, or the next this? And we've already got those. Why do we need more of those? We have so many issues and so many things that need addressing, just even in our local communities, that why are we not looking to, and there are, when I say why are we not looking, why is the money not being filtered towards those who are doing that necessary work, rather than developing another wellness app or another food delivery app?
Yeah, and it's pretty clear our incentive systems are oriented to do what they do right now, and it's going to require quite a bit of imagination to invent a system that will reward other kinds of behavior. But we invented the first one, so we can invent another one. It's not like it dropped out of the sky and this is the one we get to use. We actually have the capacity to do that.
The time is now. Given that we're in this pandemic, that for most of us, well, I think for most of us, the rules of the game have been broken. We've realized that what we were once calling normal is no longer normal, or never really was. And so we're in this, I do believe that we're in this liminal space where we have the opportunity to really fundamentally shift, and change and create new things and new models, because I think that a lot more people are less risk averse, because we've seen what's been happening. So people are going, well, that didn't work, let me try something new. And so, we're not the only ones having these conversations. We're not the only ones doing this. And what we're trying to do, to the part of the intro that you mentioned about me being a curator, is we're also looking at finding those other people, those other organizations that are doing similar work or having similar conversations, and just coming together.
Yeah, count me in the Generative Futures Initiative boldly now, and we're happy to participate in any way we can. We have a kind of a crazy model where a majority of our time is spent doing things that don't make money. Most of our time is doing the things we think really need to be done in the world, and then we try to make enough money to keep the ball rolling. And I think you probably recognize that. And a lot of us in this boat are there now. I want to talk about something that just occurred to me, since we're talking about technology, and we started talking about indigenous culture and other kinds of wisdoms and other kinds of technology. There's a topic that most people don't talk about too much, and that's the technologizing of human beings. In our current system, we've technologized human beings. We've become widgets, so to speak. We're good for doing your grocery shopping, or we're good for any number of things. And kind of from a systems level, they see us like a subroutine in a program. Human beings are not counted as humans inside of the Western technological landscape. And I don't have any answers to this. I know there's a lot of philosophers who have talked about this, Heidegger and Adorno and people like that, even as early as the 30s and 40s and 50s, talking about how this was happening in the West. But do you think that there's something that we can learn from a kind of a different technological wisdom, so that humanity can kind of reclaim its place as being human beings instead of being an instrument?
I think that, for me, a lot of it goes back to, again, the language that we use. So we refer to businesses as operating like machines. Then the humans within those machines are referred to as resources. And so you have human resources or human capital. And that tells me everything that I need to know about the system. Because then you're not recognizing the human as an individual. You're not recognizing them as a potential, helping them to try and achieve their their potential. But because when it's a machine, people talk about this is a well-oiled machine, and this is, And that in itself creates a narrative of how the system works and the fact that it may never shift. And so we need to, first of all, I mean, this pandemic has enabled us to be able to recognize the human in each other, to look it through the Zoom, to recognize people and to be able to say, how can I help you? What do you need? Yeah. Those levels of support. And as things start to open up and, things get back to what people call the new normal, I don't know what that means, but, when things start opening up, I really want us, and I've spoken to business leaders about it, let's make sure that we keep those human aspects in there. So recognizing that everybody has a human right to good mental health and well-being. And as business owners and business leaders, you also have a duty of care to make sure that you aren't burning your people out and that they have a good work-life balance and they have, that they come to a workplace that is psychologically safe for them. Well, you can't do that, or it's difficult to do that if you're constantly referring to the business as a machine, or referring to people as resources, or referring to them as capital, because you're dehumanizing them. And then you add the layer of technology on top of that, and it becomes process-driven and efficiency of, processes and market share and all of those things. So there's that whole reframing that needs to happen for us to be able to really start to recognize businesses. I mean, so not businesses, but to recognize people and to try and shift the way that we do things. It's not impossible because we've already seen a lot of the things that people said were impossible have been happening. For example, working from home and actually enabling people to choose their starting times to match their bodies, their own slick circadian rhythms. All of that has actually increased productivity.
It occurs to me just from our earlier conversation that maybe we need to adopt the language of ecosystems and living systems to talk about organizations. And one of the things that though it just occurs in that, it's like in living systems we have like birth, life, and death, and entire systems and ecologies change and evolve over time. I'm thinking here, I'm in Colorado, and if you look at a forest fire that sweeps through an area, there's this big cycle where flowers come up that haven't come up in 30, 40 years. There's seeds that are in the ground that require the fire to break them open. And so there's these natural, longer cycles. But when we create a company, we want it to be monolithic. We want it to be around forever and dominate forever. We don't build in cycles. And we certainly don't honor or respect a retreating cycle. We only respect growth. We don't respect this company's in its later life stages. And isn't it wonderful what it's produced, and honor it and celebrate it, and then have it come apart and become something else. It just seems like we really aren't even close to having a living systems framework for thinking about the way we organize ourselves.
Exactly. I mean, I recently finished a course with Frio Capra, who's a living systems thinker, a philosopher. And, I learned so much on that course. But again, it's definitely about recognizing that we have to change our approach to understanding how we operate, that living systems, there is a process of metamorphosis or transformation or whatever language you want to use, that as one thing is coming to the end of its, as we call it, life cycle, parts of it are transformed and utilized. That symbiotic relationship is utilized in something else. So the idea that businesses have a 5-year business plan or a 5-year strategy says that it's going to be fixed and rigid for 5 years, when we know the rate of change of technology, technological development and everything, even, 2 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that we would be here. And so those 5-year business plans have kind of gone out the window for a lot of organizations. And so we have to think in a way, I think that we should be thinking in a way that is fluid and agile and, ready to adapt so that we can be proactive rather than just reactive when something happens.
Yeah, it occurs to me that this all boils down to the fundamental distinction that we have a zero-sum economy. And that the only way to continue to win in an environment is to control the environment, to control the people in it. If you can control enough, then you can continue winning over and over again. Versus the living systems, the goal of the caterpillar is not to win the game of leaf eating or whatever it is. It's to play out its life cycle and its process, and then contribute to becoming a butterfly, which contributes to pollination, which contributes to more habitat for more butterflies. And it's almost unimaginable in a way that we can transform all the things we need to transform if the name of the game is that we're going to get as much stuff as we can and pile it up and hold on to wealth and hold on to energy and hold on to money. There's no natural system that works like that. It's just human beings that have figured out how to, to stick energy in pockets and store it away.
But that's the key point that you talk about, that we're energy. You mentioned energy.
Yeah.
Everything is energy, and energy never dies. It's just transferred. And so that's what we have to look at. I think as you were speaking, what came up for me as well is this: we also need to look at our political systems, because those are, and whichever country you're in, they all seem to be in a particular way. This is very much top down, vice-like grip on everything else that happens, and they are supposedly elected representatives. And I say that very loosely, supposedly representative. But going back to your earlier point, we're in a digital world. So what should politics be in this digital world, where the borders and boundaries that we used to look at in terms of country and nation state and all of those things are now more fluid and now more open? We've got people, organizations and governments now talking about vaccine passports for people traveling across borders. Well, how will that work? Those are the sorts of things that you're asking me what excites me. Those sorts of things excite me. Those questions about what should we be doing now so that we are less reactive and more proactive, but doing it from a place of ethics and morals and empathy, and breaking down these old colonial structures and ways of dividing and conquering and negating the various people's contribution to the bigger system.
I feel like I want to have a whole dinner with you just to talk about that specific topic. I do feel that it's like when you pull on one thread of this conversation, you end up impacting all the rest of them. And what came to mind when you were saying that is that, our political systems that we have, most of them are around 200 and 250 years old, maybe a little bit younger, the communist movement a bit younger, but they're well over 100 years old. They were thought of by our, great-great-grandparents' generation and back, and they were innovative when they came out. And there's no doubt about it. The capacity to move capital in the capitalist system, to move people in the communist system is an upgrade over what we may have had 500 years ago, or certainly 1,000 years ago, in terms of being able to organize people. But the systems themselves are continuing to replicate themselves, almost as if the survival of the ideology is more important than the flourishing of people.
What I think what you're talking about there is this ideological game of chicken. Nobody wants to step off. Nobody wants to be the first to step off and say, well, we're going to change things. And so everybody just keeps going. And it's this constant keeping people on these hamster wheels, which burn people out. No wonder we have such high crime rates in many cities, because people are just on these hamster wheels of going, well, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. And I think a lot of that is down to ego. Ego comes into that as well. Because a project or an idea pattern I recognized last year is something I call the ecological triptych. The link between colonialism, capitalism, and climate change is the ego. Because we will all say, well, yes, I recycle. Yes, I'm going to go vegan. I'm going to do all of this stuff. But we will still fly to Bali to go and do a yoga retreat because we can afford to. And so those things go out the window then, because it's, well, I need this. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's very much the individualistic, I need this and I need this to validate myself or what have you. And that's where all the competition and all of these things continue to keep going, which is, it's sad. But I do think, and I'm not talking about, somebody said to me the other day that, oh, you're talking about utopia. I'm not talking about utopia either. I'm talking about recognizing that there are other ways of doing things that are more equitable and bring equality and are ethical, and that technology has become an enabler of some of that. And one of the recently, Marcus and I were hosting some Clubhouse sessions, and what we do is we come up with these provocations, and one of them we talked about was, is technology now just really a dog whistle for colonialism?
Mm-hmm.
But it's that high pitch thing that we don't really hear, but it's still keeping things separate and keeping things, these rankings and these hierarchies. Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
It's like your face. Like,
no, really good question. I mean, and there's no way that's inescapable. I mean,
yeah.
It's the ultimate expression of the capitalist colonial system. It's an ability to divide and conquer and win at a long distance with billions of people. I mean, like it's the ultimate power play, although we put it in these kind of light, fluffy, I'm just communicating in 144 characters frame. It is, and we've seen it be used for good, and we've seen it be used for, totalitarian uses, and we've also seen the power that's been granted the people that run these corporations. We're getting ready to have a trillionaire on the planet, and that is the most bizarre, nauseating thing that I can imagine. That was technology that did that. That's what empowered that. So I think the answer to that is a pretty simple yes. What are we going to build to replace it? That's a really hard question.
But you mentioned trillionaire. What came to mind for me is this idea that we have of philanthropy. That then we have these billionaires who will decide, well, I think that this money should go here. Mm-hmm. And again,
that's colonial right there. Like a single person gets to decide what's good for the people. Yeah, that might even be back to like Egyptian times. We've built pharaohs for ourselves. God kings that get to decide everything about everything.
Yeah, so I'm really starting to understand and research more this concept of effective altruism. Uh-huh. About recognizing where the work needs doing first, not one person deciding, well, I've got, and yes, lots of wonderful things have been done with the money that they've donated, but is that the most effective use of making sure that we maintain this planet or maintain, support life or all of those things? There's so many different ways of looking at this that I think one of the first things for all of us is what I've been doing, what Marcus has been doing when I work with clients, is get people to recognize where their ego comes into things. Mm-hmm. And the decisions, and not in that big kind of, I'm going to, what have you, but it's those small decisions that you make that influence everything else and creates a ripple effect.
Yeah, and when we think of making money in philanthropy, philanthropy is great, and in the philanthropic work that's been done is great, but the cost of the making of the money, both in terms of people cost and planet cost, make it so the philanthropy could never catch up. And you could give away billions and billions of dollars a year, and it's a full-time job to give away money. It's not like it's easy, and it just shows it's like taking with this hand and trying to put Band-Aids on this hand doesn't make sense. Let's stop for a minute. I mean, I think the whole world needs a little bit of a timeout beyond the pandemic timeout, but like a real timeout. Like, let's all pause and how about we all take a year and just figure out how to make things work? And that obviously that's probably not likely to happen, but it's definitely there's something about being able to step back. And when you talk about the ego keeps driving us forward. Wisdom has a step back, listen a lot more, speak slower, come to conclusions slower. One of the things that's certainly important, I think, is beginning to use our imagination in that regard, and imagining what might look different or how it might work differently. So that work is very important. And I know you've done a lot of work in storytelling and narrative and art, and how do you see that world impacting our capacity to maybe adopt some new systems that would be more beneficial for people and planet?
We still use, for most of us, we still use one particular storytelling framework, the hero's journey, which in itself is colonial, which in itself is very much a particular, it's one hero, one journey, one guru or mentor who supports them. And the hero is usually a cis white male. So it doesn't give space for anybody else. And it's this, and so we're still in this, pandemic. And we've all seen that there's no one savior coming to rescue us. There is none. And so we've all had to realize that, I have to look at my own resilience and recognize that I'm part of this story and I'm a storyteller. And so, I mentioned the framework, that our Cyborg Shamanism framework, that's what it is as well. It's a storytelling framework. Because what it does is it gets everyone to recognize that we are all part of this and we all have part of the framework. So we use the word cyborg to get us to think, what does it mean and could it mean to be human and what could we be capable of? And we use shamanism as a provocation to actively seek out other ways of knowing, other knowledge, other wisdom, other technologies. And then when you bring those two worlds together, you've got this flatter, decentralized structure or system of there's no one hero, there's no one guru, there's no one mentor. We are all learning from each other in this symbiotic relationship, because ultimately we're all trying to do the same thing. And I think that's what we need to do with our story, change our storytelling frameworks that aren't giving the same narrative, the same visual representation, the same kind of North Stars, because those narratives create ideas of what a North Star should be. And people are working towards those North Stars. But then you end up having systems that are biased or unjust or all sorts of things. So even when you're projecting these narratives, there's a lot of people that won't even be able to get the first foot on the ladder.
Right. And as you start thinking about, longer term futures, like 100-year futures, and adopting a new narrative approach, or the framework that you spoke about, what are some, I want to ask you what it might look like in 100 years, but what are the most important questions? What are the things that if we were to organize ourselves to begin to tell a new narrative, what's the first thing we have to ask to get so that everybody gets a foot up on that first step? Like we together take a step forward. What do you see there?
The question that we ask is, what type of ancestor do you want to be?
Yeah.
And that tends to hit pretty hard to the core, because it's not parent, grandparent, it's ancestor. So we're talking generations, and it also means that we have to recognize that every second that we are here now in this present, we are already an ancestor.
Yeah.
And so it's how do we, what is the longer term sustainability, the ideas, all of those things. But that's the question that we always ask.
Well, and that gets us out of the ego, right? If I can get beyond the end of my lifetime, then I'm not going to see any reward for the work. If I can get beyond the end of my children's lifetime, then, hey, even a statue is not going to matter that much. And if I can get beyond their children's children, then I'm going to remember my name. I mean, maybe like written down somewhere, but I'm not going to be like a person to them. I'm an ancestor, maybe somebody given respect and honor, but there's really nothing in it for me. And I think that can be really powerful if you can get far enough out. 200 years is a good time frame where you can be sure that you're not being self-serving, and work at those kinds of time frames. But that's really extraordinarily difficult for a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah, never said it was easy. But I think that this last 18 months has made a lot of people ask themselves existential questions.
Yeah. Who
am I? What's important to me? Who do I want to have around me? What impact do I want to have in the world? And and realizing that it's not, for many people, it's not just been about myself and my family. It's more, how do I make sure my neighbors that we had the mutual aid support groups coming up. How can I make sure that my neighbors that I've never probably met before, never spoken to, have food, or water or what have you? How can we? And so there becomes this. There has, for many communities, many individuals, this sense of giving, and reciprocity without ego. So I'm not doing it because I want to give something back. I'll get something back, or I'm going to, put this on the chart and say, well, you owe me, 2 toilet rolls and a bag of sugar. It's actually, I just want to make sure that you are okay. And I think a lot of people have done that. Unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier, politics and governments and the decisions that have been made have got a lot of people into a state of frustration where people just go, I've had enough. I just need to just be me. But I do think that there have been some really big lessons that have been learned from that. And I hope that we start to, or continue to recognize the value that we as individuals can bring, and that one person can make a difference.
And do you think, kind of given the things that we're up to dealing with, whether it be the pandemic or, we still haven't witnessed the economic fallout of this. I mean, our government's been pumping lots of money into economies, but that doesn't mean that that individual people's lives are not really been damaged by this. Do you think we can do that and kind of keep an eye on our overall impact on the planet now and towards the future? Is this maybe a new new way of operating for human beings, that we can help people to maybe operate at more than one individual level at a time?
I hope so, but I also recognize that the conversation we're having is still from a very privileged viewpoint.
Yeah.
And I just thought it's important to actually recognize it and acknowledge that we're still having, even though, talking about people can make these decisions, we're still talking about it from a very privileged viewpoint. Yeah. There are a lot of people that, have lost not just family, but, livelihoods, and there's no infrastructure in those countries to even give people the bare minimum support. And so whilst we are having this conversation, we are still talking about a certain percentage of the population of the world. And that actually, when we're talking about scarcity, there's no scarcity of land. There's no scarcity of natural resources, no scarcity of water and the stuff that we need. But it's the way, going back to what we talked about with the billionaires and the money, it's where the money lies that is the issue. And how that's distributed or not, that is the issue. It's not for the want of trying or, the desire to change our lives or for people to, I remember I spoke to a friend a couple of years ago. We were on a business trip, and he said that the biggest lottery in life is where you're born. And that says it all, right? That is the biggest lottery. None of us have a choice about where we're born and the time and to whom and everything. And that starts the clock ticking in a particular direction. And I think that that's what we need to recognize and acknowledge. Those of us who are in these privileged positions should be recognizing that and thinking about what contribution, how am I contributing to that positively or negatively?
Yeah, and it's not just where, it's, what body color, skin, height, weight. Yeah. I have a propensity to being over, big person, little person. It's like there's all these things that are so not even something we can choose, or it's just the way it goes. And you're right, there's such a hierarchy of who gets a place in line in a different spot just based upon that. And I'm a white man. I'm up near the front of I'm tall, I'm thin, I'm athletic, I'm smart, educated. Like there's so many boxes that I tick, and but even that's kind of a little immobilizing a little bit. It's like, oh, can I get out of line? Like what? How And so we have allyship and all these things that we're learning to do, but it doesn't remove the structure. It doesn't, I cannot go into a grocery store and not get preferential treatment. I can't wear a sign around my neck saying, hey, don't treat me better because I'm a man. Or my daughter calls me up and has to go to a shop and get something. She's like, I'm afraid they won't listen to me, Dad. And I'm like, well, you have to, stand firm and, and then in the back of my head, I know that if she gets in trouble, she can put me on the phone. And so that structure is still there and it's ever present. And especially for women and young women, you can just see them, and my daughters are white girls. They're up way up in front of the line too. Could you just imagine? I can't imagine being back down that line. And so
And that's where true allyship comes that's where true allyship comes into place, because we need to, I think all of us at this moment in time are going through some form of trauma and racial trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, I'm a Black woman born in the UK to an African father and Caribbean mother. And the first time that I was made aware of the color of my skin, I was young and it was traumatic.
Mm.
And so that has been with me throughout my whole life. Whereas, especially now with Black Lives Matter and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and everything else that's happened, a lot more people and white people are recognizing that, oh, wait, I have been getting preferential treatment. And the systems that I built my ideas and my views and my North Stars on has always been skewed towards me.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this sudden, and I do workshops on this for clients as well. And, for some of them, it's been, well, why didn't I recognize this before?
Mm.
How did I not see this before? And what can I do now? And so there is that's also a form of trauma, because everything that you've believed or have been led to believe, for many people, they recognize, no, well, that's not the case anymore. And so that's where you start to get this fear and fragility of change, of things changing. And so people have to go and do the work and recognize, and to that point, people have to do that inner work first and understand themselves and be truly honest about what biases they may have and how they can then overcome them and step in and lean in and recognize when actually you are getting preferential treatment. Well, if somebody in the shop, if you know that you're in the shop and somebody gives you preferential treatment, why not, the person who was there before you, who may be a person of color, that they have bypassed, you actually just say, well, no, they were there first.
Yeah.
Those are the sorts of things of being aware of the nuances of these things and then speaking up, because that's where the idea silence is violence comes from. If you don't say anything and you see it, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's never going to be, a walk in the park. It is going to be uncomfortable, but the more people that do that, the more people that recognize that, the more it will change.
And you're talking about, not new ideas, critical race theory's first papers were written in the 1970s, the big seminal work in the 1990s. Critical theory goes back to the Frankfurter Schule and the scholars there in the 1960s talking about how we had to have psychology and anthropology and sociology in our research around philosophy and how we have a good life. So this is a long tradition. And one of the things that occurs...
Sorry, the 1850s, ex-slave and abolitionist Sojourner Truth wrote a speech, Ain't I a Woman? She was talking about it in the 1800s.
Yeah.
1800s. So it's not anything new.
Right. Well, in this, you just mentioned that there's a scarcity of money, but there's also somehow a scarcity of ideas. Not that there's not great ideas and great thinking out there, but our access is greatly limited. And, they spoke about TV being the opiates of the masses, or religion, and now it's TikTok. We have this proliferation of thinking and ideas that have no weight and no impact. They just entertain us for brief minutes. But then there's these concepts, critical race theory being, one that's been around for a long time and in academic circles, researched and worked on. It's where systemic racism ideas come from. It didn't get any movement until somebody was against it. Until somebody said, oh, well, we don't want any of that. Then suddenly there's some interest in it. And it occurs to me that we kind of have a scarcity of access to great thinking. Human beings have done some great thinking over the past, 10,000 to 100,000 years, depending on what we can gain access to. But
why do you think that access has been limited?
Well, I certainly know. I know in terms of my daughter studied African philosophy this past year at the University of Leiden, and their professor was really clear. The West just repressed. They said there was no way Africans could have philosophy. They were incapable of it, and just erased it completely off the planet. We know in the United States, the indigenous cultures they didn't have culture. They were brutes. They were savages, right? And so they erased their philosophy and wisdom. But
it goes
not completely.
But it goes to the things that we've been talking about. Who controls the narrative?
Right.
That same hero's journey framework, that narrative, and then things are packaged up as isms. So, when I do workshops and sessions on racism, I always start by saying, well, before you even get to racism, you have to understand colonization was 1500. Racism as a concept was the 1920s.
That's right.
So racism is a strategy to maintain that process of colonization and colonialism. And so most of the isms that we have those kind of origins. And we have to recognize that you can't shift one without the other. You can't just say, well, we've dealt with racism now, that's it, it's done.
That's all.
We've dealt with sexism now, it's done. We've dealt with ageism, it's done. All of those things are interconnected. They are living systems. And so, it's what is the motivation? What's the greater motivation for people to try and change some of those things? Because you change one, everything else has to change.
Right. Well, and there's a lot of people that are highly invested against having nothing change. I mean, not just like, oh, no, I don't like change. It's like, no, it's a threat if things change. Power structures, hierarchies. We talked about, some of the uber wealthy, that they're not going to just likely open the gates to their mansions and say, come on, everybody gets a bedroom. It's not likely. It could happen, but it's not going to happen widely. So then what are we left to? What are our tools? Violent revolution? Heavens, please, no. I mean, that just replicates the old model. And we just see how that hate begets hate. How do we disentangle this Gordian knot without destroying the whole thing? It's really a big question. And I think one of the ones we should be contemplating the most.
So what you're saying reminds me of a quote that I use whenever I'm preparing a talk or a workshop or anything. I always go back to the same quote. And it's, we talked about storytellers. The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. I think that's how we do it.
Yeah.
We don't go in, I never go in and say, I am the expert in this and you must all listen. I say, listen, I'm a storyteller. And if I can get you to ask yourself questions about what your real opinion of this thing is, or, that what have you, then it means that it's worked, because it means that you've had to lean in and you will go away and you'll think about those questions. What you do after that is about choice. But, it's getting people to ask themselves questions, to think differently, to become critical thinkers and philosophers and, all of those things. I think that we are all of the innovation is just problem solving. So all of us have the potential to be innovators. All of us have the potential to be futurists or artists or storytellers. It's just how much we lean in, or, how much we are sometimes given the opportunity to breathe and to be able to be recognized. Everybody wants to be recognized and to be seen, really seen. And I think that that's a starting point for a lot of this as well.
Yeah, I just want to tag that for our listeners and viewers here. Everybody can be an innovator. Anybody can solve a problem. Collectively, we can solve lots of problems. And there's a part for you to play. There's things for you to do. And, just from our perspective, every single life matters. Every single person's expression and beingness, whether it's, whether you're a person of color or you have a different sexual identity or preference, or you have strange religious views, or you don't wear shoes, or whatever it is, that in no way means you have any less capacity to be genius in your imagining of a future. And honestly, if you're a person of color who doesn't wear shoes and has different sexual designation than normal, you're probably more likely to come up with innovative solutions than those of us who come from straight up in the box. And so we need our outliers. We need them to be empowered to imagine, and we need them to be supported in their imagination. When they come up with crazy ideas, we need to go, that's a crazy idea, we should try that. Yeah, so I feel inspired by you and by this conversation, and I really am curious to see where this goes next. I think we're in this, you said, this liminal state. And liminal states are places where we can create big imagination and make big plans. And then there's this other state called getting to work. And I'm very curious to see, what the next 5 years is going to bring in that regard. We have a lot of ideas, we share ideas, but how do we get to work to help spread these narratives and stories and support people? These are things at the top of my mind. I am going to be following you very, very closely. Hopefully we'll get to spend some time together in person in the next 6 months to a year. Yeah. I'm so thankful that your mission is my mission, and certainly any way that I can help support the things you're doing, or like if there's anything you need, I personally, Boldly Now, Generative Futures Initiative will be there right beside you.
Well, the thing that we're working on at the moment is its current name is the Living Library. So, but it is that about language, looking at what are the micro and meta narratives that are used to define our words, and how do we use those to validate ourselves, validate our behaviors. So we're building this. It will be an AI platform, but that's what we're doing, of looking, and all of the stuff that I've spoken about today and we've had in this discussion is going into building that platform. Wow. To be able to start to say, well, what does this word mean, and how is it used in this context, and where does it originate, and where is it now, and where could it go? I'm so
happy about that. I have I call it a memetics of words that I use repeatedly. There's about 130 terms in there that I've just defined for myself, because when we use these terms, we have to be responsible for their impact. And so we better know what they mean and better know how we mean to use them. So I'll be happy to have that conversation with you guys another time too. I do believe you're right. I do believe either inventing language or adopting old language, ancient language ideas, and moving them into common vernacular can be some of the longest levers, especially we as storytellers can use, but some of the longest levers for culture in general. And that I like. No, I just love the fact that now you're bringing technology to it as well. We're gonna potentize this capacity to create powerful language.
But then going back to your original introduction, I'm an artist as well. So what we're doing is looking at, yes, language, but then when we only use spoken words, does it mean that everything has to be English, or what language do we choose? And so what I'm doing as an artist is looking at how I take those concepts and remove the spoken language from it. So I created a soundscape, looking at creating immersive experiences that means that more people have access to understanding what these things are, and that it doesn't create a hierarchy again.
Yeah, being able to even language, speak English, for example. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that it can scale.
Yeah. And we all know that language, there's art in translating language. It's not, there's no science in this word in this language versus this word. There's some amount of art. And that's where biases creep in. And that's where we can filter them out as well. We can create some kind of artistic. And then I love the embodied art concept as well. I am not an embodied artist, but I have a huge amount of appreciation for those forms, because of their capacity to convey something without the words, something that hits you here without understanding here. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for having this amazing conversation today. I'm sure we're going to have many more as time goes on, and we try to help people to climb on board with some of this thinking. I think it's important that people see that we as well are working and struggling our way through these ideas and trying them on and seeing how they fit, and seeing that there's gaps in our own understanding, our own capacity, our own, et cetera, and that, people like you and me are out there constantly trying to learn and share what we've learned to create more opportunity for people to make a bigger impact. So
definitely.
Yeah,
I would love to have a conversation with you offline as well to find out what we're doing and how we can support each other.
Absolutely. We'll certainly be doing that, maybe even in a couple of minutes. So that's it for all from the Boldly Now show and the Generative Futures Initiative. Thank you for joining this conversation. If you need resources, visit our websites at generativefuturesinitiative.com and bold.ly. Adah, what is your website? It's Adah Parris, right? ADAHPARRIS Technologizing.com. I want to give you a little shout out because you on your website you even list your values, and I read your values and I felt really kind of inspired that you put that on a public place, along with bio and work and media and all kinds of ways that you can get involved in.
It's important, that it's important to know what I stand for, and so that people are very clear. And then, that's, if we think about the relationships we have with individuals, we choose our friends, our family, what have you, based on their values. So why wouldn't we do the same thing when we're trying to choose who we work with?
Okay, I'm gonna steal that idea and publish my values on my website. I've done the work, I just haven't published it. So you're encouraging me to get out there in that way. Well, thank you so much for this time, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
The Boldly Now Show, igniting the world of burning desire, big ideas, and bold action.
Boldly Now is an initiative of the Generative Futures Initiative, generating a thriving future for humanity. Learn more at generativefuturesinitiative.com.